Imagine walking into an old library, the air thick with the scent of yellowed pages and time itself. Sunlight filters through tall, arched windows, casting long, silent patterns across the rows of books. Most visitors are drawn to the main shelves, where the familiar classics and new bestsellers stand in orderly lines. But some souls are pulled elsewhere, toward the places few notice, let alone explore. They are drawn to the forgotten aisles. In the heart of the city's oldest library, down a narrow, dimly lit corridor, lies such a place. Tucked away behind imposing reference stacks, it is a silent graveyard of knowledge, home to out-of-print encyclopedias and obscure histories. This aisle is more than just a physical space. It's a repository for the stories that have slipped from memory, waiting patiently in the shadows. It was here that a young woman named Clara found herself one bleak autumn afternoon, her fingers ghosting along the spines of books untouched for decades. The titles grew more enigmatic the deeper she went. The lettering was faded, some in archaic scripts she couldn't decipher. And then she saw it. A single, battered volume with no title on its cover or spine. It was bound in dark, cracked leather, strangely warm to the touch. It was a nameless tome, an anomaly in a building dedicated to classification. Every library has one, or so the whispers say. A book so mysterious that even the catalog cannot define it. It might be a forgotten diary, a collection of local legends, or a treatise on a lost art. This one, however, felt different. It felt expectant. There was an almost electric anticipation as she cracked open the cover, the spine creaking in protest. The pages were brittle, the ink a faded brown. The script was an elegant, looping hand, telling a story of a young woman's quiet life. Her walks through a city park, her lonely evenings by a rain-streaked window, her anxieties and her dreams. It was mundane, yet strangely compelling. But at the bottom of every single page, the same 5 words were written in a slightly darker ink. A stark postscript, addressed directly to the one holding the book. You are already in my book. What begins as a fleeting curiosity can quickly spiral into an all-consuming obsession. At first, for Clara, it was just a strange detail, a literary quirk. But the phrase echoed in her mind. With each new page, the story pulled her in further. The narrative tightened its grip, and suddenly, it wasn't just a story she was following. It was a puzzle she felt a desperate need to solve. This is no accident. The human brain is wired for stories, hardwired to seek patterns and closure. When a narrative presents a gap, an unanswered question, it triggers a psychological itch that compels us to keep searching. For Clara, that itch became a constant presence. She spent hours poring over the book, trying to find a clue to its origin, its author, its meaning. She searched online archives and historical records, but the book simply did not exist outside of her own hands. The more she read, the more entwined she became, the story shaping her thoughts and coloring her days. The nameless tome was no longer just a book. It had become the center of her world, a search for meaning in a mystery that felt deeply, unnervingly personal. For centuries, diaries have served as mirrors, reflecting the inner landscapes of those who write them. Clara was a devoted diarist. Every evening, as twilight pooled against her window, she would open her own journal, a simple, cloth-bound notebook, and confide her thoughts to its crisp, blank pages. Her diary was her sanctuary, a silent listener to her triumphs and anxieties. It was the one place she could be completely honest, especially about the strange book from the Forgotten Isle and the unsettling effect it was having on her. She wrote about the book's protagonist, whose life felt so eerily familiar. She documented her growing obsession, her fruitless research, her mounting unease. The diary was where she processed the impossible. It was her anchor to reality, or so she thought. One evening, a week after finding the tome, she was rereading her own entries. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. The paragraph she had written last Tuesday, describing a chance encounter with a stranger at a cafe, was almost identical to a scene she had read in the Nameless book that very morning. The conversation she'd recorded with her sister on Thursday mirrored, word for word, a passage of dialogue from the tome. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a chilling synchronicity. Her life wasn't just similar to the story. Her diary was becoming a perfect reflection of it. The events she lived and recorded were appearing in the pages of a book that was written long before she was born. The mirror had shattered. Her private confidant had become a transcript of a pre-written fate. The ink on her own pages no longer felt like her own. It felt like an echo, a memory of a life she was being forced to live. It was just past midnight when the air in her small apartment grew heavy and still. The only light came from her desk lamp, casting long, quivering shadows. Clara, clutching her own journal, paced the floor. She had avoided the Nameless tome all evening, but the time had come for a confrontation. She could not live as a character in someone else's story. With trembling hands, she opened the ancient book to a random page, determined to break the spell, to assert her own will. She decided to tear the page out. Her fingers closed around the brittle edge of the paper. She pulled, but the page didn't tear. It resisted, feeling less like paper and more like tough, leathery skin. She pulled harder, a desperate sob catching in her throat. And then, something dark began to well up from the fibers of the page. To coincidence, it was a chilling synchronicity. Her life wasn't just similar to the story. Her diary was becoming a perfect reflection of it. The events she lived and recorded were appearing in the pages of a book that was written long before she was born. The mirror had shattered. Her private confidant had become a transcript of a pre-written fate. The ink on her own pages no longer felt like her own. It felt like an echo, a memory of a life she was being forced to live. It was just past midnight when the air in her small apartment grew heavy and still. The only light came from her desk lamp, casting long, quivering shadows. Clara, clutching her own journal, paced the floor. She'd avoided the Nameless tome all evening, but the time had come for a confrontation. She could not live as a character in someone else's story. With trembling hands, she opened the ancient book to a random page, determined to break the spell, to assert her own will. She decided to tear the page out. Her fingers closed around the brittle edge of the paper. She pulled, but the page didn't tear. It resisted, feeling less like paper and more like tough, leathery skin. She pulled harder, a desperate sob catching in her throat. And then, something dark began to well up from the fibers of the page. A thick, ink-black fluid seeped from where her fingers gripped the paper, running in a slow, viscous trickle down her hand. The metallic, coppery scent was unmistakable. It was blood. Her blood. The book was bleeding her own life onto its pages, and the wound refused to close. A whisper, like the turning of a page, seemed to fill the silent room. The book was alive, and it was feeding on her. Panic seized her. She had to return it. She had to put it back in the forgotten aisle where it belonged. She ran through the deserted late-night streets, the bleeding book clutched to her chest, a grotesque, living stain spreading across her coat. The library was closed, its great oak doors locked and barred. But she found a night service window, a small slot for after-hours returns. She pushed the book through, a wave of relief washing over her as it disappeared into the darkness within. But her relief was short-lived. A new, more terrifying thought took hold. What if the book was already part of the system? She remembered the old card catalog in the library's archive room, a dusty relic from a time before computers. On a desperate hunch, she went around to a side entrance she knew was sometimes left unlocked. It was. She slipped inside, the vast, dark library swallowing her whole. She found the archive, its rows of wooden drawers holding the library's long history. She pulled open the drawer for unclassified acquisitions, her fingers fumbling through the cards, and there it was. A new entry. The card was crisp, the ink jet black and impossibly fresh, as if written only moments ago. It was not a record for the nameless tome. It was a record for its author. Her name was printed in neat, block letters, Clara Meadows, and beneath it, the title, A Life in Passing, and beside that, a single, chilling date. Not a date of acquisition, but a checkout date. A date she did not remember, a transaction she never made. The library hadn't just acquired a book. It had catalogued a soul. Just acquired a book. It had catalogued a soul. Her soul. As the narrative draws toward its devastating conclusion, the world contracts around the protagonist. Allies fall away. Opportunities for escape evaporate, and the forces they have fought so hard against tighten their grip. For Clara, standing in the silent, dusty archive, came the final, soul-crushing realization. All her choices, all her struggles, had been nothing more than the turning of a page. She was not the reader of a tragic story. She was the tragedy itself. The book was not a prophecy of her life. Her life was simply the fulfillment of its text. The sense of inevitability was absolute. She thought back to the phrase that had haunted her from the very beginning, the words at the bottom of every page. "You are already in my book." It was not an invitation or a clever turn of phrase. It was a statement of fact. She was a character, her fears and her hopes merely ink on a page. Her frantic struggle for freedom, just another chapter approaching its pre-written, heartbreaking end. The book of her life was closing, with the chilling finality of consequence reminding her, and us, that some stories are not meant to be read. They are meant to be lived, and their endings cannot be changed.